image. So we started with the pen tool, right? Last week you guys were creating shapes and you were tracing. This week now we're continuing tracing, except this time we're using the pen tool in the capacity of creating paths. And yesterday we learned we can do lots of different things with paths, such as make selections. In this instance, we can attach certain things to that path. And in this instance, it's a brush stroke. So ultimately that's what we did yesterday. We used the pen tool to create paths, and then we attached a brush stroke to create that outline or tracing effect of our image. Here is the actual image that we are using. We're only going to be creating the trace of her head. We're not going to do the detailed bricks or the chair that she's sitting in or her clothing. It's just her head and her hair, which is attached to. But this is very similar to the project that you guys will work on next week. So the process that you guys are going through, there's not a lot of steps, but there's a lot of repeating of those processes, right? So what has been the process up to this point, right, that we've repeated over and over again for quite some time? Well, the first thing is we created the trace layer, right? So with that trace layer, we're creating paths, and we're attaching brush strokes to those paths. With the pen tool, we create that path. It's important that you make sure that you set your pen tool to path. Remember, there's two settings, shape and path. We want to make sure that that's path. And also, when we're creating these paths, we want to make sure that we're doing so to the actual, to the actual trace layer. Okay, so we'll continue that today. If you are working off your own document, fantastic. If you feel like your document is not up to par where it needs to be, then you could certainly download the hair, face, neck, day 2 file and work from that. All right, so I'm going to bring back in my background. We're going to continue tracing. We have what's left, which are nose and eyes. Now, the nose can be a little tricky, especially if you're not familiar with how to actually draw a person's nose, whether you've taken a 2D art class or you haven't. This could be difficult. So it is definitely not how you might think it is, because most people, and I see this all the time, people will trace the nose like this, right? Like that's not how you draw the nose, right? The nose is not two-dimensional. It's not, I mean, the lips aren't two-dimensional, but they're more two-dimensional than the nose is. So because that nose kind of protrudes, we have to draw this in a way that kind of eludes that 3-dimension. Okay. All right, so again, we're going to go back to the pen tool. We have a path. We're using the trace layer. Here we go. We're going to start that curve in the shadow. So wherever the shadow is, that's where we're going to create that curvature of the nose. Not on the bridge, but on the inside of the nose. So right in here is where we're going to create that line. So right about near the eye, we'll click, and then we'll go ahead and make that curve. And then we're just going to follow that nose. There we go. There it is. Right, so right on the inside of the eye, on the inside of the nose, we're going to wrap right around that first nostril. Not where the nose hits the face, but where the nostril is, like the furthest part out. Right, so right there, right around and around. That's the shape of the nose. Okay. For our brush stroke, let's use, I think we're using 5. I think 5 pixels is enough. Remember that rule of thumb that we talked about yesterday when tracing, the larger the object is, the larger the brush stroke. So for example, the hair, that was a very large shape. So the larger the item, the larger the brush stroke, the larger the trace. The smaller detailed items should be smaller brush strokes. So again, we'll keep this at 5 pixels. And remember, we can use our shortcuts, right? Our shortcuts certainly will help us work more efficient. So the shortcut for the brush tool is what? B. The shortcut for the pen tool is P. Right? All right, so I'm going to go back to my pen tool. I have a black stroke. We've set that to 5. Right-click, stroke path. This is all we did yesterday. brush. If you weren't here yesterday, we talked about what we can attach to as far as stroke path, pencil, brush, eraser. We have all these other types of edits that you can attach to the path, but in this instance, we want to use a brush. Click OK. Hit Enter to accept that. And then we'll go ahead and do some nostrils. So I'm gonna change my brush stroke here from 5. Let's knock this down to about 3 for our nostrils. Again, I'm tracing on the trace layer. With the nostrils, we're going to keep this fairly small. Again, we want these attached. So I'm going to click on the black line here. Just real small nostrils. We don't want them big. We just want to allude to the fact that they're there. Right click, stroke path, enter, enter to accept. Same thing over here. Real small, not very big. There we go. They're really more shadows than they are actual nostrils. So we'll explain that a little more in detail when we get into painting, which we'll do later today. All right, the eye. Okay, the eye. The eye has lots of different shapes to it, and this can kind of be a little tricky as well. For example, like we have an eyelid, we have eyelashes, we have the eyeball itself, the iris, the pupil, the way that it's set inside of the skull and the cheekbone, right? So there's a lot of things to kind of contemplate and think about here. So we'll start with the inside of the eye, right? So that's where the actual eyeball is, right? So the inside of the eye. So I'm going to go ahead and start my click here. And we're just grabbing we're not grabbing the eyelash, just the inside of the eye. There we go. We are using a brush stroke that's set to 3 because this is smaller detail. So we want that smaller detail there. Back to my pen tool, shortcut P, right click, stroke path. Okay, and then the eyelash, we're not going to create every eyelash. So we're just going to create the shape of the eyelash. There we go. Make sure those lines are touching. Right click, stroke path, enter to accept, enter to accept. And then we have, there's a little bit of a line here showing where the eye sets into the face. So we'll go ahead and create that. Right click, stroke path, enter, enter. And then we have the eyelid area. So we'll create a line to show that as well. And then we have the eyeball. I know I'm going pretty fast, but again, it's a process, right? You're tracing, attaching, you're tracing with the path tool. You're attaching the brush stroke. All of this is going on the trace layer. So it's just rinse and repeat. And we have the actual, so now we have the iris here. Now we need the pupil. And remember, we have multiple pen tools. Why not use the curvature pen tool, especially for the pupil, right? It's round. Let's make this easier for us. So all right, so there's the eye. Right, I'm going to go ahead and continue this for the other eye. Same process, right? Same shape, it's just mirrored, right? So again, on the trace layer, I'm going to start the inside of the eye. Go back to my regular pen tool. The eyelash. The eyeball. Or the iris, I should say. The eyelid. And of course, lastly, the iris, or the inside of that eyeball. All right, so there's what we've done today so far, the eyes and the nose. I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a second, let you guys get caught up. All right, so again, make sure that you pay attention to these two things. The size of your brush stroke, right? That will really affect the quality of your work, I should say. I mean, you'll still be able to create a cartoon character regardless, but you know, if you make sure that the big details get the big brush strokes and the smaller details get the smaller brush strokes. So you can notice that if I zoom out here, you can see, if I zoom out here, you can see where the hair is the biggest parts. I'm frozen. The hair is the biggest part of this graphic, so therefore it gets the bigger stroke, right? The chin we start to go down in size. It gets a smaller stroke. The nose, I probably could have made that nose a little bit smaller. I mean, it's hanging in there. But obviously the lips and the dimples, those got smaller. And then obviously as we get more into the more details, the eyes, they certainly get a lot smaller. Okay, if you keep everything the same brush stroke, it's just going to look really chunky and not very good. Also, the curves that you're creating, if you haven't quite mastered, and it's hard to believe that you would, I mean, you guys have been working with a pen tool for not so long, but if you haven't truly mastered that pen tool, right, don't be afraid to use the curvature pen tool, right? Like, just as an example, right, there's the curvature pen tool. It is very easy to create a circle by using that curvature pen tool versus if I try to do that with the regular pen tool, right? That's quite challenging because I have to. It's just I use the pen very well, and it's even hard for me to create a perfect circle without using that curvature pen tool. So even after the fact, right? So even after the fact, if your curves aren't exactly where you want them to be, right? Go back in, change your pen tool from the pen tool to the curvature pen tool, and then you can clean these curves up simply by clicking on those points and moving them around or adding points. Okay? So don't be afraid to use those tools that I've been showing you to help you create better paths or even shapes. All right, next step. So we completed the big part of this process, right, which is creating the outline of our subject matter. In this case, it's the young lady here in the picture. The next step is to paint. So very much like a painting or comic or coloring book, right? We have the outline, how we fill in the spaces with color. We're going to do the same thing here in Photoshop. Okay. Now, here's where you have to be very careful. We do not want to apply any painting or color to the trace layer. The trace layer is there to show us the outline, right? So it's like, you know, imagine when you were back in, I don't know, middle school, elementary school, and you had a coloring book, or maybe you even have a coloring book now. They have adult coloring books. And you go to color, and everybody always says, stay inside the lines, right? So that trace layer is the lines. We want to keep that trace layer intact. We don't want to apply any color to it. So therefore, we're going to be doing today, creating a lot of different layers to paint on, okay? And those other layers are going to control the colors that we're going to use. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, here's the first step, right? We're ready to start adding color. We need to make a selection. You will always make the selection from the trace panel. Okay? But before we make that selection, now is probably a good time to introduce to you a new tool. It is a rastered tool. It's the paint bucket tool. The paint bucket tool works kind of like the paintbrush tool, only where the paintbrush tool you have to actually, add strokes, like you're actually going up and down with your mouse. With the paint bucket tool, it's one click and it fills the area with color. So the paint bucket tool is just above the pen tool. It looks like a paint bucket tipped over and you have paint spilling out of it. I think that's a pretty good representation of that tool. So let's talk about that tool for a second. So as I said earlier, it's like the paintbrush tool, only that when you only click once and that paint spills out into that area. Well, the physics of it is very similar to real world physics, right? If I had a big paint bucket and I just went into the middle of the room and I started pouring it onto the floor, where would that paint go? On the floor, right, yeah. I just said it's going on the floor. Where would the paint stop is probably the better question. Say again? Right, if it hits something, right? So the walls, the bookshelves, if I'm standing there, it's going to go around my feet, right? So that's the same way that the paintbrush tool works inside of Photoshop. Wherever you click, it's going to fill that space. So watching my screen, here's a good little example of how this is going to work. Again, you're just watching. Kind of zoom out here real quick. Right? So I'm going to take my paint bucket. Let me change my color to a color that you guys can see a little better. Okay. I'm going to click in this empty space right here and watch what happens. It fills all of that space, stopping where these pixels are, right? Like it didn't go into this area because, well, there's nowhere for it to go. So let me demonstrate this a little bit differently. I'm going to get rid of some of these pixels. Ready? Paint bucket. I'm going to click in the same area. Uh-oh. Because there was a breakage in those pixels, it continued to spill into that area. Here's another good example, right? It could only go so far, and then there's some light gray pixels that stopped it from filling into this area. So that's how your paint bucket will work. Fortunately for us, we're going to be creating selections. If you remember at the beginning of the year, when you make a selection, you're selecting a range of pixels, and you can only affect what's inside of those pixels. All right, so again, we're going to make a selection from the trace layer. That's why this trace layer is so important, because it helps us make these selections. So remember when we use the quick selection tool like the magic wand, when we click in an area, right, those pixels are going to impede it from spilling out, right? So here we go. We're going to start with the hair. So I'm going to select here. And you'll see here now I have the inside of the hair selected, but I want you to stop for a second before you go further. Right? I know that you guys can probably guess what we're going to do. But if I grab my paint bucket tool, right, I've made a selection. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this hair, and I'm going to paint that selection. It may appear as, well, fantastic, we painted the hair. Not so quick. Look here. It's missing some of these pixels. It's leaving a space between where I made my selection and where my selection stopped. So this is a little problematic for us. Okay? So, but that's okay. I have a fix. At the beginning of the year when we were talking about selections, we talked about how we can save selections, we can load selections, we can also modify selections. Well, and that's what we need to do here now, is we need to modify this selection. So I'm going to click on Select, Modify, and then there it is, right? So we can We can contract. So maybe we wanted more space. Maybe we wanted space between those lines. I don't know. In this instance, we don't. We want to actually expand this selection so that way we fill in that extra space. When we click expand, we're going to say by 2 pixels. We could do 3 pixels. That might be getting, especially for our smaller details, that might create some problems for us. So I think 2 pixels is more than enough. So we make our selection, click on select, modify, expand by 2, click OK. Create your new layer, call it hair, and then that's really where we should stop. So I'm going to back up all the way. I'm going to undo. Yep, I'm going to redo. I'm going to start from scratch. Here you go. Ready? So here's the process. Here's the process. Okay. And I am going to bring back in my background so that we can see this, because we're going to need this for color. Right? So here's the step-by-step process. We already talked about the tracing process, right? Create a trace layer, create paths, attach stroke paths to it, make sure your brush is the appropriate size. Painting, using the paint bucket, right? So we're going to select the trace layer. We're going to grab my magic wand. I'm going to click inside of the area that I want to paint. I'm going to create my new layer. Call it hair, if you're following along. I'm going to expand that selection. So select, modify, expand by 2 pixels. Now, I'm going to grab my paint bucket. And if you remember from lessons in the past, right, we can hold down the Alt key for that medicine dropper or the color picker, whatever you want to call that. Right? And now I can sample areas of my screen, and you should see my foreground here is changing, right? So I'm going to click in an area that's kind of a light brown, not too dark, not too light. That seems to be good. And now with the hair layer selected, I'm going to go ahead and click in my selection, and there I've painted the hair. I can do Control D to deselect, and I can move my trace back on top. Okay. And really the only thing left to do there is just to double check, make sure that I filled in all those spaces. So if I zoom in here, use my hand tool, yep, looks good. I filled in all that space. Uh-oh, looky here. Right? I've got a little problem area right here. Okay? Not a big deal. Right? The paint bucket tool is the same as the brush tool. The difference is just how they react when you click on something. So I'm going to go, what tool do you think we're going to grab to fill in this area here? Say again? Well, you've got 2 choices. Paint bucket or brush tool. Thank you. Yeah. I prefer the brush tool. So I already have that color selected. I'm using the hair layer. This is where people get in trouble. Never color the trace. Always color the layer that you're working with. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm just going to paint that. I'll maybe make my brush a little bigger. Might help make this a little faster. Right? And then again, try to don't go outside of the lines. There we go. So you're going to find that in this process, you might not get all of that area painted the way that you want to, so no big deal. Just got to go back in and make some fixes. And you'll see we'll do that throughout the process today. All right, so we've got the hair done. Let's do the face. So again, where do we grab our selection from? What layer? Trace. So we're going to grab the trace layer. Grab that magic wand. What's the shortcut for magic wand? Once we have it selected, it's W. So remember, those shortcut keys can really save us some time. All right, so I'm going to click on the trace layer in the face. I'm going to bring back my background. So in the face, I click. I'm going to create a new layer. We're going to call this face. Grab my paint bucket. Shortcut is G. Hold down the Alt key. Be careful not to pick like any of the areas where she has makeup, because that is gonna be really weird color. So we want to grab that really light color, which I think right underneath her eyes right here, even on her nose is probably not a bad place to be. Okay. Then with the face layer selected, I'm going to click, and we've painted her face. Control D to deselect, move the trace layer back on top. I'm going to do this quite a bit of times, so if you guys just want to watch my screen for this first few moments and then go off on your own, that's not a bad idea. All right, let's do the neck. So again, from the trace layer, grab my magic wand, shortcut W, click on the neck area, create a new layer, call this neck. I'm going to expand this, right? Select, modify, expand by 2 pixels. Grab that paint bucket, shortcut G. Grab my color. Don't get too dark. Like I'm going to grab down here at the bottom of her neck. With the neck layer selected and the paint bucket tool, I'm going to click. There we go. Control D to deselect. Drag the trace layer back on top. Let's do the lips. We've got 2 parts of the lips. We got the top, the bottom. So again, I have my trace layer selected. Magic wand, shortcut W. Bottom lip. Expand it, modify, expand by 2 pixels. Create that new layer. Don't forget to create the new layer. Bottom lip. We'll name that. Shortcut G for my paint buckets. Hold the Alt key. Grab that color for the lips. Bottom lip layer selected. Paint it. Control D to deselect. Move that trace layer back to the top. You've got the top lip. Grab that magic wand. Make the selection. Expand that selection by 2 pixels. Create that new layer. We'll call this top lip. Grab that paint bucket, shortcut G. Hold down the Alt. Let's pick a different shade of that pinkish red, if you will. Paint it. Control D to deselect. Move the trace layer back up. Now, because I've done this quite a bit, I obviously know that there's going to be some space in here that's not quite filled. So I'm going to zoom into the space. And the top lip, I'll grab the B for the brush tool. Grab that color, and I'll just fill that space in. Same with the bottom lip. Oop. Make sure I'm doing that on the right layer. Top lip. Bottom lip. All right, with the nostrils for the nose. Okay. I don't really need to, like, I'm not going to, those are really shadows, and I technically could include the nostrils to be a part of the trace layer. So, in fact, I am going to do that. So with the trace layer selected, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more here. With the trace layer selected, I'll go ahead and grab my brush tool again, except now I want to use black as that color. And I'll just go ahead and just paint in the shadows. Just make sure to stay inside the lines there. So again, for the nostrils, you're following along with me, we're just going to attach that painting of the brush to the trace layer, because technically it's a part of it. I mean, if you wanted to, I guess you could, you could very well do that. All right, time for the eyes. Again, it's the same process over and over and over again. I think I've got a little bit of a error in here. I need to see here. Fix this up a little bit. There we go. Actually, I need to put that on the face layer. There we go. All right, so back to the eye. Okay, so again, same process from the trace layer. Make your selection. Let's do the eyelash first. We'll paint this black. So select, modify, expand, 2 pixels. Grab your paintbrush or your paint bucket, shortcut G. Make sure you create that new layer. Call this left lash. Paint this black. Left lash layer. Click Control D to deselect. I can see here, obviously, it didn't grab all of that, so no big deal. I'll just come in here again with my paintbrush, kind of clean that up. All right, so now we have the eyes. All right, so I'm going to do we'll call the inside of the eye, the white part of the eye, we'll just call that the eyeball. Okay, so again, making that selection from the trace layer. Okay, I'm going to grab the inside, and I need to add to this selection. I mean, I could do it separately, but let's just all knock it out in one big swoop. So I've made the selection there. I'm going to hold down Shift. Remember, Shift brings in the ability to add to my selection. So I'm going to click there. Again, modify, expand by 2. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my paint bucket, shortcut G. I'm going to change the color to white. Create that new layer. We'll call this eyeball. Left. And then we'll paint that layer. Drag the trace layer back to the top. Control D to deselect. Now we have the iris, the left iris. So again, from the trace layer, grab your magic wand, select the iris, modify, expand that by 2, create a new layer, left, iris, grab your paint bucket, grab your color, paint it. Control D to deselect, move the trace back to the top. And then we have the pupil from the trace layer, magic wand, shortcut W. Select the inside of that pupil. Select modify, expand that by 2. Create that new layer. We'll call this left pupil. Paint bucket, shortcut G. The color we'll use for that is going to be black. Drag that trace layer back up, Control D to deselect. There we go. Eyebrow. Let's do the eyebrow. Same process. Grab the trace layer, magic wand, make your selection, modify that selection, expand it by 2. Grab your paint bucket, shortcut G, grab your color, create that new layer, left, brow, paint it, drag that trace back to the top, Control D. All right, so there we go. We're halfway there. Well, we're more than halfway there. We're almost done. I am going to stop there. Right, so you've heard me say the process over and over and over and over again, right? So whether you put that to memory or you wrote it down in notes, those are your processes for this, probably 2/3 of the process, right? First third is tracing. The second third is painting. The last and final step is going to be adding texture to this image, and we'll do that tomorrow. Okay. I will finish the eye and the eyebrow tomorrow as review. If you guys want to continue and finish this on your own, go ahead and do so. But tomorrow I will go ahead and pick up where we left off and continue painting the eye and the eyebrow. Okay. But remember, the big key to this is making sure that we don't add color, right? So if I take away all this color here, I want to make sure I don't add any color to my trace. I want to keep that trace by itself so that it stays on top and it defines all of my areas, all of my cartoon character. All right. We'll pick up where we left off tomorrow.